Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking what is absolutely one of the most incredible, data-backed comeback stories in modern tech history. We're looking at a company that was pushed to the absolute brink of extinction only to re-emerge in a way that is actively reshaping multiple global industries.
Just think about that for a second. If someone told you back in 2020 that a company completely cut off from Google, cut off from TSMC, and cut off from Qualcomm would somehow manage to beat Apple's iOS, challenge legacy automakers like Mercedes, and essentially push NVIDIA out of the Chinese market in just 5 years, you probably would have laughed, right? It sounded entirely impossible based on where they were.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to map out exactly how this happened. We'll start with their fall from dominance, look at their billion-dollar R&D pivot, check out the 7-nanometer chip surprise, explore their new ecosystem, step onto the AI chip battlefield, and finally ask, did sanctions accelerate innovation? To really grasp the scale of this comeback, let's start with Chapter 1, the fall from dominance. We actually need to look back at where Huawei stood right at their absolute peak. So in 2020, Huawei wasn't just a big player, they were the undisputed #1 smartphone brand on the planet. They officially dethroned Samsung, selling 55.8 million phones compared to Samsung's 53.7 million. But they weren't just making phones. They were literally building 5G infrastructure in over 170 countries, pulling in a staggering $131 billion in revenue that year alone. I mean, they were an absolute global titan. Then came the 2019 US ban, which rapidly cut them off from American technology. Now, when we look at the history of this ban, two main arguments usually emerge. On one side, you have security concerns, fears regarding Chinese laws requiring companies to cooperate with state intelligence, coupled with the founders' historical ties to the military. But on the flip side, some analysts point to market competition. They draw historical parallels to the 1980s, when the U.S. placed heavy sanctions on Japan's rapidly booming semiconductor industry to protect domestic companies. Whichever lens you view it through, though, the impact of these sanctions was immediate, and it was severe. Right before the sanctions took full effect, Huawei commanded a massive 20% share of the global market. Think about that. 1 in 5 smartphones sold anywhere in the world was a Huawei. But look at this whiplash. In just 9 months, that global market share plummeted to a mere 4%. It's just wild. They suffered an 82% decline in smartphone shipments. Their revenue completely collapsed, going from $136 billion down to $89 billion in a single year. By literally all traditional metrics, the company was suffocating. Which brings us to Chapter 2, the billion-dollar R&D pivot. With their supply chains completely severed, Huawei realized they had to strip out all American components from their products. They had to look inward to survive. Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer scale of their financial commitment. It is staggering. They didn't just try to quietly weather the storm. They doubled down on innovation. In 2019, they spent $19.46 billion on R&D. By 2025, that jumped to $28.42 billion, which is nearly 22% of their total revenue. Over 10 years, they've poured more than $170 billion into research. And to fund this incredible survival pivot, they willingly absorbed a 28% drop in their net profit. They basically bet the entire farm on their own domestic engineering. And in Chapter 3, the 7-nanometer chip surprise, we see the very first massive, world-shocking payoff of that incredible R&D spending. So the entire tech industry pretty much assumed Huawei was entirely locked out of advanced chips. The sanctions blocked them from buying state-of-the-art EUV lithography machines, and their partner, SMIC, was thought to be stuck making much older 14-nanometer chips. But then, August 2023, right while the U.S. Commerce Secretary was visiting China, Huawei quietly launches the Mate 60 Pro online. No big press conference, no spec sheet. The absolute shocker? It was powered by a 7-nanometer chip. They had ingeniously bypassed the lack of EUV machines by pushing older DUV technology way past its known limits. Not only that, it was the world's first mass-market phone to support satellite calls, entirely without Western tech. Naturally, it sold out in hours. As impressive as the hardware was, Chapter 4, Building a New Ecosystem, shows us that hardware was only half the battle. Surviving meant they also had to overcome the devastating loss of Google Android and its entire app ecosystem. Their solution? HarmonyOS Next. And I want to be super clear here. This was not just a reskinned Android. Not at all. They stripped out the Android open source code completely. There isn't even a Linux kernel in there. They built it entirely from scratch, basically pushing developers to rewrite the top 5,000 Chinese apps for this totally new platform. Just to put this in perspective, tech giants like Microsoft and Amazon have tried and failed to build rival phone ecosystems. Yet by Q1 of 2026, HarmonyOS Next captured 19% of the Chinese market, officially surpassing Apple's iOS at 17%. They essentially secured 55 million users on an entirely new, independent operating system. And this brilliantly illustrates how they scale that ecosystem way beyond just phones. Unlike some competitors, like Xiaomi, who went out and built their own car factories, Huawei strictly avoided manufacturing cars. Instead, they became a pure tech supplier to existing automakers, providing HarmonyOS, 5G, electric motors, and advanced autonomous driving tech. And this strategy worked flawlessly. In 2025, over 589,000 vehicles powered by Huawei tech were delivered. That is a 32% growth rate. They are now actively dominating the $140,000 ultra-luxury EV segment. They're literally beating out legacy giants like Mercedes and BMW in sales by supplying the brains of the cars rather than the metal. But Chapter 5, the AI chip battlefield, takes us to the most critical modern battlefield of all. Remember, NVIDIA's top-tier chips were completely banned for Huawei. They had to find another way to compete in AI. Their engineers were facing a pretty harsh reality. On a strict one-to-one basis, a single Huawei AI chip only delivered about 60% of the performance of NVIDIA's best chip. So they changed the rules of the game. First, they assessed the limitations of that single chip. Then they link thousands of their slightly inferior chips into one massive cohesive system. Finally, they scale. Quantity overcomes quality. By functioning as a totally unified cluster, their total compute power actually doubled NVIDIA's best system in certain benchmarks. Because of this, China's most important new AI model, DeepSeek V4, is actively optimized for Huawei chips right now. They're shipping 750,000 AI chips this year, projecting a massive 60% jump to $12 billion in AI revenue in 2025. You honestly cannot overstate the gravity of this achievement. Listen to this. In May 2026, NVIDIA's own CEO, Jensen Huang, stated, "We have really largely conceded that market to them." I mean, wow. NVIDIA, the undisputed global AI champion, essentially acknowledged that Huawei has successfully reclaimed the massive Chinese AI market. So the crucial point here is how they actually plan to keep this momentum going, especially without Western manufacturing tools. Look, the industry standard is Moore's law, which is kind of like shrinking cars down so you can fit more of them on a highway. You make the transistor smaller. But Huawei is championing something called the tall scaling law, or logic folding. Think of this as keeping the cars the exact same size, but drastically widening the road. Instead of shrinking the transistors, they are focusing on moving the data much, much faster inside the chip architecture itself. By making this fundamental, brilliant change, they achieved a 55% power boost in a single leap. They are now ambitiously aiming to match TSMC's 1.4 nanometer performance by 2031, entirely without Western technology. Let's move to our final section, Chapter 6, Did Sanctions Accelerate Innovation? Let's see how this all builds to a very complex reality about their global standing today. Look, without Google services, Huawei is pretty unlikely to reclaim their absolute global dominance in smartphone sales across Western markets anytime soon. But in the realms of domestic infrastructure, electric vehicles, and, crucially, artificial intelligence, they have become an entirely self-sufficient powerhouse. They built their own hardware, their own software, and their own AI architecture, which leaves us with this provocative question to ponder. Did these unprecedented sanctions actually stop Huawei, or by forcing them into a corner, did they inadvertently accelerate one of the greatest technological leaps of our time? Thanks so much for learning with me today, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.